Good evening, everyone. My name is Hugh Price. I'm Academic Director of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our second annual Margaret Boden Lecture. The lecture is named in honor of Professor Margaret Boden, a remarkable Cambridge-trained pioneer of cognitive science and artificial intelligence, and for many years, Professor of Cognitive Science at the University of Sussex. Our inaugural Margaret Boden lecture was given a year ago by Professor Boden herself, and you can find the recording of that online. Within days of that event last June, Maggie gave us a ranked list of people she recommended herself for future lectures. And at the very top of that list was tonight's speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment. Now, Maggie had been very much hoping to be here herself tonight. She had some health problems during the winter and told us after that she'd cancelled all commitments in spring and summer except for this lecture. Unfortunately, she's been unwell again recently, and so she can't be here tonight, but I'm sure you'll all join me in wishing her a speedy recovery. I first met tonight's speaker about 35 years ago. In fact, I remember the date. It was on July the 4th, 1980-something, probably 1985, because it was in Australia, and he was in Australia that year to give the Gavin Young lectures at the University of Adelaide. I was a postdoc in Sydney, and Daniel Dennett, already a star both within and outside philosophy, gave a talk at Macquarie University in suburban Sydney. It was a bitterly cold winter's day, middle of winter, the southern winter. At least bitterly cold by Sydney standards. I think the temperature plummeted by below 10 degrees, which is very unusual. And somehow I offered or was volunteered to give the speaker a lift back into the center of town, where he was staying with the late, great Sydney materialist David Armstrong. I remember two things about that trip, apart from the weather and my nervousness at having such a distinguished passenger. One was a conversation about an idea that I was trying to work on at the time. And the other was getting lost in an unfamiliar part of Sydney, so that I had Dan to myself for rather longer than anticipated. Today, Professor Dennett is co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies and Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University, where he's taught for many years. He's the author of about a dozen books, many of them long since classics, and I think some 400 or so papers. He's not just one of the world's most famous philosophers, but surely one of the best-known public intellectuals in any field. Clearly, Maggie knew what she was doing when she made him her number one choice to deliver the second Margaret Boden lecture. So please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Dennett, who's speaking to us this evening on smart machines and a reverse Turing test. Welcome, Dan.
There's Maggie. Wish her all well. Seriously, a little round of applause for Maggie, because I'm sure she'll be watching the video of this soon. Get well quick, Maggie. The question is, smart tools or artificial colleagues? There's a difference. Now, the question is, will the difference disappear as machines get smarter? And my answer is, not if we're careful and proactive. Not if we can help it. In order to see why we want to keep that distinction alive, I want to take you on a little history through the Turing Test. I spoke at DeepMind yesterday and was fascinated to discover that a lot of these brilliant young people, hundreds of them working at DeepMind, are surprisingly unacquainted with a lot of the history of AI. and made me feel particularly old when I realized that, yes, I have been in on some of the early days in AI, and I want to make sure that this history doesn't get lost in the furor. So here's Alan Turing, one of my all-time heroes. I put him right up there with Darwin as my two favorite intellectuals, I guess, of all times. And he wrote a famous piece, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, published in the philosophy journal Mind way back in 1950. But he had a predecessor, somebody who said something remarkably similar a few hundred years earlier, and that's Descartes in his Discourse on Method. Famous passage. Just let's go through it so you get it in your head. Here's Descartes in 1637 saying, "It is indeed conceivable that a machine could be so made that it could utter words, and even words appropriate to the presence of physical acts or objects which cause some change in its organs. As, for example, if it was touched in some spot that it would ask you what you wanted to say to it, if in another that it would cry that it was hurt, and so on, for similar things." He goes on. "But it could never modify its phrases to reply to the sense of whatever was said in its presence, as even the most stupid men can do." Now that certainly sounds like the Turing test. And notice that Descartes says this is his proof of dualism in a way. Yes, you could make a machine that could do some of this, but it couldn't do it all. It couldn't respond to the sense. It couldn't understand. That was a brilliant thought experiment in his day, but I want to say it was a failure of imagination. What was it? What Descartes couldn't take seriously was the idea of a machine with 1 trillion moving parts, like you or me. More than 1 trillion, actually. Quadrillions of moving parts. He just had no way. I have the presumption to imagine Descartes thinking, well, let's see, do I know that no machine could respond to the sense of things? Well, let me imagine such a machine. Let's give it 10,000 gears and 20 miles of wires and 60,000 springs, and no, it couldn't understand. And he wouldn't bother trying to imagine a more complicated machine like you or me as a machine. So that was a failure of imagination on his part. And so he just never thought about it. Turing comes along with the Turing test, and he introduces it by telling us about what he calls the imitation game. And in the imitation game, I don't know if he ever played it, but I've witnessed it played. And by the way, I encourage you to have a shot at it. It's very easy to do these days with email and laptops and smartphones. One person pretends to be of the opposite gender. So if the woman is the player, she pretends she's a man and has a man, say, as a judge. And in fact, you have to have two. You have a man and a woman both claiming to be a man, and they're interrogated by the judge. And if the man can convince the judge that he's a woman, or if the woman can convince the judge in another test that she's a man, then that's winning the imitation game. Any of you ever played it? It's very challenging. I want you to think about just how challenging the imitation game is. Do you think you could win at that game? Now, Turing's motivation is in itself, I think, wonderful and important. He wanted to create a screen through which only the right stuff would pass. That's why he restricted it to teletype communication, so that none of the inessentials of personal quirks or appearance would matter. Only, by his lights, pure intelligence could get through the screen. This is, of course, a policy that's been adopted by, for instance, orchestra auditions with very good effect. When a new person auditions to be the first oboist in a symphony orchestra, they have a bunch of auditions. The oboists are all play from behind a screen. Doesn't matter what they look like, doesn't matter whether they're male, female, white, black, doesn't matter whether they're fat or thin. What matters is can they play the oboe. That's all that comes through. And this was the inspiration for the imitation game. Do you think you would be a good judge in the original imitation game? Or do you think you could fool a good judge in the imitation game? It's a pretty challenging game. And I say, try it. You might be fascinated with the results. An imitation game puts a premium on imagination, on deep world knowledge, a strong model of the interlocutor, and cunning. In other words, the winners are good deceivers. That's as good as tautological for winning in the imitation game. And here's another failure of imagination, in this case, Turing's. Here's how I think he thought. A woman who could simulate a man that well would be brilliant. A man who could simulate a woman that well would be brilliant. Therefore, anything that could win the imitation game would be an intelligent agent, a machine that could think like us. What was his failure of imagination? Well, Turing couldn't take seriously the idea of a deep learning pattern finder, not an agent with hierarchies of goals and comprehension, but just a deep learning pattern finder feeding off trillions of online conversations. He never imagined such a thing, so he never thought about it. But it opens up, and some people have rushed in, another possibility of winning the imitation game, where the goal in the Turing test is to convince a human judge that you're a human being, not a computer. There might be, as it were, a backdoor way of winning that. The deep learning way, not the thinking like a human being way. It's interesting that Turing missed that, because notice in the imitation game, the tacit argument is not that anybody who could convince a good judge that he was a woman would have a woman's brain or a woman's mind. No. Still have a man's mind, but just have a very good idea of what a woman's mind was like. But he missed the idea that maybe you didn't need to have a very good theory of what a woman's mind was like or what a human being's mind was like. All you'd have to do is have access to so much data and so much pattern finding that you could simulate a woman without understanding what you were doing at all. That was something that Turing just missed. But he had a second failure of imagination too, and that was he overestimated the discriminating power of everyday people. It's much easier than he imagined to fool people into thinking they're dealing with an intelligent agent. Much easier. Here's Turing's optimism. Famous quote, "I believe that in about 50 years' time it will be possible to program computers with a storage capacity of about 1 to the 9th, to make them play the imitation game so well that an average interrogator will not have more than a 70% chance of making the right identification after 5 minutes of questioning. That's, in retrospect, profoundly optimistic. First of all, that a computer, he was deciding that that was a computer of sort of unimaginably great powers in his day when he wrote it in 1950. But of course, your mobile has much more memory than that, and can't win the Turing test. Well, we've known that there was a problem of overestimating the discernment of everyday people for quite a long time. My old friend Joe Weizenbaum created Eliza, the first sort of chatbot program, way back in 1966, and wrote a book about it a few years later, Computer Power and Human Reason. Still well worth reading. The book has got some fundamental confusions in it. Joe never got clear about whether he was saying AI was impossible or AI was possible and we shouldn't do it. And the book vacillates between those two very, very different claims. What I want to say today is, in principle, it's possible. Yes, strong AI, conscious AI is in principle possible. Joe was wrong about that. But it's much, much, much harder than people think. And we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't do it. That's going to be my message today. Joe was at MIT. He was one of the inventors of time sharing, and there was a public terminal in the great long corridor at MIT where students could access the time sharing computer and they could access Eliza. And so every day he gathered hundreds of conversations that MIT students had with Eliza, this dead simple, cheesy, but ingenious program. And to his horror and dismay, he discovered that the MIT students were very angry and upset that he was looking at these transcripts because they said it violated patient-doctor privilege. They were pouring their hearts out to this simple program, and they didn't think he had any right to read the transcripts. It was that moment that turned him into the Jeremiah of AI that he soon became. I got to know him about that time. Actually read a draft of the book before it was published and talked with him about it. Then a few years later, I was involved in Rodney Brooks' COG project, the sort of first serious humanoid robot. And I'm just going to give you a tiny sampling of what amazed me then. COG's eyes, well, you can see COG's eyes. They don't look much like eyes. A pair of cameras, two in each eye, a high-resolution focal camera and a parafoveal wide-view camera. But the eyes moved, saccaded, and did smooth pursuit, just like human eyes. And just the fact that this robot would go could absolutely mesmerize people. Alan Alda, in his Scientific American program, came to the lab one day and was interviewing Rod about COG. Rod here, COG here, Alda here. Rod says a little bit about what COG can do. Alda interrupts to ask a question, and COG goes. And he just couldn't continue. It was as simple as that. COG's arms had these wonderful series elastic actuators. They were wonderful loosey-goosey arms, and it could go back and forth with a slinky. I brought one of my teaching assistants from Tufts over one day to the lab, and COG's arm was not even attached to COG. At that point, it was clamped to the bench, and Matt Williamson, the creator of the arm, said to her, Well, shake hands with it. She reached over and she shook hands and she screamed, "It's alive!" It was that powerful an illusion. It was, there were MIT students that organized a protest on behalf of Cog's rights. Cog, MIT students. Cog was nowhere near conscious, but Cog had the behavioral manifestations which were unlike the stereotypic robot. And it captured people immediately. So there's some failures of imagination. Now I want to tell you about my failures of imagination. I defended the Turing Test at a piece in 1985 called Can Machines Think, where I didn't anticipate anything like deep learning as a possibility, and thought that the Turing Test, properly executed with clever questioning, was the best test I could devise for intelligence. So I defended the Turing Test absolutely. Well, philosophers' thought experiments are unlike real experiments. The sun always shines. The subjects behave. The equipment works flawlessly. So what did I learn in a real experiment? Which brings us to 1991 and the first Loebner Prize test, restricted Turing test. So the original Loebner Prize committee were these 6 individuals: Joe Weizenbaum, Alan Newell, famous AI person with Newell and Simon from Carnegie Mellon, Harry Lewis, professor of computer science at Harvard, Oliver Strimple, who was the director of the Computer Museum in Boston, where the contest was held, Robert Epstein, who was the sort of executive head of the committee at the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Science, and Van Quine. And they put together the original rules and set up the competition before I was invited to join the committee as the chair. So I didn't get any chance to object to the rules that first year in the competition. And here are some of the restrictions on that test. The topic at each terminal is limited. Judges have been instructed to hold normal conversations, and experts in the field are excluded. Human confederates have been instructed to hold normal conversations instead of going out of their way to compose answers that are inimitably human. I would have objected to the second and the third condition. The first was there couldn't be a competition unless you allowed the conversations to be restricted. We got a nice help from Duncan Luce, who gave us an idea for how the judging should be done. The judges would first rank order all the contestants. There were 10 in all, in fact, and from most human to least human. And then they were obliged to draw a line across their list saying, human above the line, computer below the line. Now, we didn't expect any program to be judged to be human. So the computer program that had the highest ranking would get the limited prize that first year. So then the event happened, and there were camera crews from all over the world. There were probably 6 or 7 different television camera crews there and reporters. It was quite a ballyhoo. And the contest got started, and I was walking around watching people watching the screens and looking over the judges' heads, and all of a sudden it hit me. People were being taken in. Even some of the press were being taken in by these, I think the technical term is cheesy programs. And these are from my actual notes on the occasion. So there's 10 terminals, Dry martinis was one topic. Burgundy wine was another. Whimsical conversation was the winning contestant, Joe Weintraub. Women's clothing, Shakespeare's plays, Human Confederate. She won 2 awards. Most Human, and she was judged by one of the judges to be a computer, on the grounds that nobody could know that much about Shakespeare. But whimsical conversation, which was a bunch of clever stunts. I'll just tell you what the clever stunt was, because it actually is important for the rest of some of the things I'm going to say. Weintraub had a few introductory chit-chat bits, and as soon as the program, the judge asked anything else, the Weintraub's program would ask the judge a question. And the judge would dutifully answer the question. And then the program would ask the judge another question, and simply lead the judge through a completely canned set of questions. And the judges, since they had been urged just to have normal conversation, they were being polite. And so they never challenged, they just docilely let themselves be led through these Potemkin villages that Weintraub had created. And when that didn't quite fit, Weintraub's program had about 10 canned jokes that just were chosen. One was chosen at random, and out it would come. That was it. That was the program. So I was worried. And so during the competition, which only went on for a couple of hours, I rushed into a back room with one of the people at the museum there and found a desktop publisher program. And we created this document which just in case I needed it. We were so sure that no program was going to fool a judge that we hadn't thought of this in advance, but we needed it. On the occasion, I had to give 3 certificates, 3 different programs convinced at least one judge that it was a human being. There were 7 misjudgments out of a possible 60. That was stunning. A few years later, 93, in the 3rd competition, we changed the rules. I'd insisted on it, and now we had journalists as the judges. And I said, your reputation is on the line. You're famous for sussing out frauds and liars. You've got to find the cheats. And we told the human judges, the human Confederates behind the scene, think of it this way. Your life is on the line. You've been captured by space pirates. You have to convince the judges that you're human. They still had restricted topics and so forth. So what was the result? 2 misidentified a human being as a computer. Nobody, and when we debriefed the judges to find out why, they had a very interesting answer. Their honor was at stake if they misidentified a computer as a human being. And they argued as follows. There's a bunch of good ones, there's a bunch of bad ones. If there wasn't one good contestant, they wouldn't be having the competition. So just to be safe, I'll take the most unimpressive human candidate and call it a machine just to protect my reputation. So this is what happens to a thought experiment when you actually put it to the test. But I think if we can correct for the imagination failures, we can still use the Turing test today very effectively. We can use expert judges who know about AI and know what the tricks are, and who keep their conversational gambits off the internet so that the competition can't parasitize them. Now, there may be billions of intelligent conversations on the internet, but that's a vanishing drop in the bucket compared to all the vastly many possible intelligent conversations that could be had. This is an important point, and I want to stress it, because it's related to a point made by Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka, who I see sitting right there, whose new book, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul, looks at what they call unlimited associative learning, which they think is a big step in the evolution of intelligence in minds, in animal minds. They were inspired by Zathmar and Maynard Smith's book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, where Zathmar and Maynard Smith talk about unlimited heredity, which is a major step in the phase shifts of evolution, transitions in evolution. And they say this is the sort of Darwinian equivalent of unlimited heredity in unlimited associative learning, which is made possible because it's compositional and it's generative in a way that opens the floodgates to novel content, really. I'm not entirely convinced by all the details of their argument, so I'm going to leap over part of that and simply give you an example of human generativity so that you can remind yourself of how many possible conversations there are. So here's my diagram of the library of Babel. This is all the possible books. There's 10 to the millionth power books. Each book is 500 pages of 2,000 characters per page from a set of 100 different characters. If you take all possible permutations of those, you get an immense number. It's not infinite, but it is an absurdly large number. Those are the possible books. Moby Dick is just one of them. There are, however, 100 million single typal variants on Moby Dick in that library. You couldn't tell which of those volumes you were reading. So it's a very big set. And I want to draw attention to that. I introduced, back in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, two terms. People often say infinite and infinitesimal, but they don't mean that. The terms I use instead are vast, for very much more than astronomical, and vanishing for sorta infinitesimal. So just to illustrate the concept, there's the Library of Babel. It's a vast set of possible books. A vanishing subset is vast. It's the subset of books that are composed entirely of English words. A vast but vanishing subset of those are grammatical. A vast but vanishing subset of those makes sense. The vast majority of the books in the grammatical set are books where you, if you want to make one of those, go to the library, pull books at random, English books at random, out of the library, copy a sentence at random, then go on to the next book, copy a sentence at random. Every sentence is grammatical, composed of English words, and the book makes no sense at all. So, but now we've got books that make sense. It's a vast set. A vast but vanishing subset of them are about somebody named John. A vast but vanishing subset of them are about the death of John F. Kennedy. A vast but vanishing subset of books in the Library of Babel about JFK's death are true. The vast majority are false. And a vast but vanishing subset of those true books in the Library of Babel about the death of JFK are composed entirely of limericks. That'll give you some idea of how large the number of possible conversations are. It is not infinite, but it is not even well sampled by what's been put on the internet to date. So I think if you have a judge that understands that and devises conversations which clearly have never had a precedent, but they're perfectly understandable to an ordinary human being, then you're going to have a good test for the time being of the Turing test. So the Turing test can survive for a little bit, and I think it can survive, if done by expert judges, for a long time. I'm reminded of an argument by Robert Frank in his book Passions Within Reason, where he argues that the most cost-effective way of seeming to be good is to be good. Yes, you can go to all sorts of trouble to be a devious person who jealously protects your reputation. Easier, quicker, just be good, and life will be swimming for you. And he makes this a centerpiece of a very interesting set of arguments. I also want to compare it with, some of you will know Thomas Landauer's latent semantic analysis. This is a forerunner of some of the pattern recognition programs that run now. Landauer wrote a program that has the following feature. Professor teaches a course, writes an essay exam for the students, writes what the professor takes to be an A answer to that exam, and then feeds all the students' exams to this program, and it grades them. It doesn't matter whether it's in French or English or Turkish or Spanish. It doesn't know anything about, doesn't know the meanings of any of the words, but it does better than the teaching assistants at grading those exams. If you ask Tom Landauer, well, is it possible for somebody to write an answer that is pure gibberish, but that nevertheless gets an A from your program? Yeah. But if you could write that answer, you'd deserve an A anyway. It's easier to be honest. The most cost-effective way of seeming to be conscious is to be conscious. So the Turing test, I end up defending it as long as it's properly conducted with expert judges, and they have more than 5 minutes. So I want to insist that AGI, conscious AGI, that's artificial general intelligence, is possible in principle. The task of making a conscious AGI is possible in principle, but very, very costly. And we can make it more costly. And we should. I'm glad that it's so difficult. I don't know if you've heard the remark. I love that somebody made the remark that the philosopher who says of something, well, we know it's possible in practice. We're arguing about whether it's possible in principle. I'm saying this is possible in principle. It's very, very difficult, but it's possible in practice. Just in case it is possible in practice, we ought to take steps to make it harder. Because a conscious AGI would be very dangerous. A better policy would devalue deception altogether. And here Maggie has some good things to say. A couple of years ago, in a British Academy panel, which you can find online, she spoke very eloquently about deception in AI and why this is a problem. How could we undo the inadvertent premium on deception that was introduced by Turing? What do I want to do? Well, I want it to be that instead of applauding verisimilitude with prizes, we should treat it as a crime of false advertising. AI is an epistemic power amplifier, which can be used or abused. So here's my recommendation. First of all, for serious AI systems that are very powerful, you should license users. Can't use the system without a license. And then you should have strict liability laws so that anybody who's licensed to use the system and uses the system and gives advice, makes diagnoses, decides political decisions, whatever, on the basis of the AI tool, is held liable for any damage done. And ignorance is no excuse. The machine convinced me, tough. You're the one who's got the license. You're responsible. Strict liability laws are, in a certain sense, unfair, but they are a clever stratagem for putting an extra heavy burden on the users to do beyond due diligence to protect themselves. Now, this would have some interesting effects. One, the malpractice insurance would be very expensive. These are very powerful systems. If you make a mistake, you might really do a lot of damage. So you're going to have a very big malpractice insurance policy. And the insurance companies will protect their investment by maximizing the transparencies of the system. If they're going to insure users for big bucks to use the system, they want to make sure the system doesn't fool the users into making mistakes, doesn't want the system to deceive the users, wants the system to be maximally honest and transparent. When it doesn't know an answer, it's got to say, I don't know the answer, and not anything else. Beyond transparency, I think the insurance companies would be in favor of a test where the system tests the user for their ability to identify the gaps. In other words, let the system judge the judges. This is a moving target. The initial tests that a system might exact of a user before allowing the user to ask real-world questions would have to be very carefully designed. But I think we could design tests which, in effect, oblige users of these systems to be undeceived, to have no illusions about the systems they were using. They would understand as well as anybody does what their limitations were and what to look out for. But here we run into a problem known as Goodhart's law. This is how Goodhart put it. Any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. Or another way of saying it, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, because people will try to job the system. I don't know whether this happened I think it happened in the United States. Insurance, hospitals were judged to be performing badly on the length of time it took to get a person to see a doctor once they arrived at the hospital. And it was very clear that hospitals were going to have to improve their practices to shorten that time, average time to seeing the doctor. So what do the hospitals do? They have people sitting quietly in ambulances outside, not starting the clock until they're sure that they can see the patient in a short amount of time. That's a sort of simple example of the sort of dodge that Goodhart's law creates. And we have to look for that everywhere. What it does, it creates an arms race. And it's an arms race that we can see in the sort of ridiculous subterfuges of subsequent Loebner Prize tests where everybody's trying to game the system. And we can expect gaming to go in both directions. But for the time being, I think we want to realize that the difference between IBM's Watson, everybody's familiar with IBM's program Watson, the one that won Jeopardy? And you might think, gee, it would be fun to have a conversation with Watson. Forget it. Watson can't hold a conversation. The communication control system for that program is paper thin and entirely dependent on the very rigid rules of the program, of the television quiz show. So the difference, if you wanted to take IBM's Watson, which won at Jeopardy, and turn it into a conversant AGI that you could have a good conversation with, it would not double or treble, but it would be orders of magnitude more work for the people at IBM to do that. I'm happy to say. The difference between Watson and AGI is like the difference between an abacus and Watson. As I say, the communicative controls are shallow and canned, and I want to say, let's keep it that way. I want to suggest a different way that AI can go, which is more benign. AI is very powerful. There are two kinds of empowerment where it's, as it were, muscle power. On the left, we have the bulldozer. On the right, we have the Nautilus machine. The bulldozer, you can move mountains, but you're still a 98-pound weakling. The Nautilus machine gives you power that you walk away with. So now the question, what would be the parallel of a Nautilus machine for the mind? It would be an imagination prosthesis. It would be a device that would train you to use your imagination better. Let AI do the heavy lifting. Let AI do the tedious data examination and save the creative thinking and the policy making to us human beings. Because we don't really want an autonomous AGI because autonomy is dangerous. How autonomous should we make a self-driving car, for instance? Well, as so often, Dilbert has a good answer. I find it offensive when you call me a self-driving car. That's my slave name. I prefer to go by the name Carl. Shut up and drive me to work, said the self-walking human. We don't want autonomous cars to be that autonomous, and we don't want AGIs to be that autonomous either. In general, we don't. In fact, there's a lovely article on this called Robots Should Be Slaves by Joanna Bryson a few years ago. Her point is, slaves were terrible because they were human beings with feelings and all the rest, but if we keep AIs without feelings and without autonomy, then they can be, there's no moral objection to slaves then. We want to keep them firmly on the side where there's no moral, where they have no rights. You can take them apart. You can use them. For that matter, you can abuse them. But they don't have autonomy. Besides, selfishly, if we use AI as smart tools to do all the heavy lifting, then we get to do all the fun stuff. We get to have our imaginations empowered. We get to have our imaginations disciplined by all sorts of AI tools that can help us think about things we never could think about before, and then we can take responsibility for it. And that's very important because you can't make a responsible AGI for a very simple reason. Because an AGI can be backed up. Years ago, I heard a wonderful saying that suddenly the import of it struck me on this occasion. Recruits, maybe draftees, first day in boot camp, and the drill sergeant lines up the motley crew and says, "We can't make you do anything." And they're all sort of smiling. "But we can make you wish you had." That's the way it is with human beings. That's how we control the autonomous agents that we all are running around free. We have rules and penalties and systems of control because these are agents that can wish they had done otherwise. Now, if you could be backed up the way a robot can, think of what you could do. Backed up on Friday, just for the heck of it, jump headfirst off the Eiffel Tower on Saturday, watch the video on Monday of your death. It would change your whole attitude towards life and obligation. That's a feature that we don't have, and it's, I think, an important feature that we don't share with imaginable AGIs in the future. If you could be backed up, you wouldn't be inclined to take this seriously. You wouldn't have a good reason to take it seriously. So suppose we do create policies that enforce the distinction between tools and colleagues, and that make the tools transparent, not putting in the Disneyfied human touches that we now view as false advertising. Here's a problem that comes up, and I mentioned that Maggie Boden raised this in her 2017 panel discussion. What about elder care? This is maybe the largest market for robots in the near future. And for good reason. More and more elder care is going to be needed, and it's not a very satisfying job for most human beings. It would be really good to have intelligent slaves that could do it. But then you think, well then, but we want to make them very companionable. The market urge to make them very human would be hard to resist. That worries me, but then I thought, no, because let them be artificial dogs. And let's keep their ability to call the pharmacy and order up some drugs distinct from their companionship roles in the household. We can keep that distinct so that they're not super smart. And they only understand a few commands, but they're still, for old folks, they're good company. There's a lot of evidence that having a dog around is very, very good for the sense of well-being of many people in elder care. But what about childcare? That's another area where maybe robot babysitters will be developed. And here, I think we have to be very cautious. Will children prefer fake companions to real companions? Fake companions that don't get bossy or disagree with them or fight over toys? Will we disable children by giving them babysitters that are, as it were, too much fun, and make them not able to grow up as they should? In other words, we have much to be vigilant about as we face this new world of artificial intelligence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dan. We now have some time for Q&A. We have a couple of roaming microphones, so if people would like to put their hand up, I'll make an attempt to keep a queue. I think the first person I saw was kind of right at the back up there.
Thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. I have a question about the idea that AI can do the heavy lifting and leave the fun stuff to us. So how then do we determine what the fun stuff is and what we can and must leave to AI? Because the reason why humans have been enslaved throughout history is because their masters wanted to have so much done by others, so much done for them, that only a human would be able to perform all these tasks, would be intelligent, versatile, autonomous enough.
Well, I guess I don't see that this is an insoluble problem or even a difficult problem that won't sort of solve itself as it goes. I'm pretty sure everybody in this room has gadgets, technology that could only be done by a human being in the very recent past. A sort of super Jeeves with a telephone. And I don't see that that is in itself a problem, although we are becoming much more bitter and fragile in our dependence on that technology. Map reading is going south while people use their GPS, for instance. Take an obvious case. I think that one of the sort of existential worries about the role of AI in the near future is that it's not just going to take manufacturing jobs. It's going to take a great deal of the white-collar jobs, a great deal of the mind work jobs, and make those a thing of the past. So there may not be much work to do. I think that's a real issue.
Yeah. Thank you for an excellent talk. So I wonder about that argument that you can't trust an AGI because it can be backed up, because then you would not take your things seriously because you could just die. But suppose I jump from the Eiffel Tower, and then on Monday I'm gleefully watching the YouTube clip, but I'm also getting the fine from the French authorities, and suddenly my wallet is going to be a lot lighter. In fact, even on Friday, before doing that, I should realize that AGIs would presumably have preferences over the world and over their future lives. So it would seem that they actually could have a lot of things to care about, even though they can back themselves up and sacrifice some copies.
Well, the fact that they can get backed up means that they don't have an ultimatum of one sort that we all have. You only live once. And sure, they can have preferences, but one of their preferences may be to take whatever steps they can to avoid having their backups destroyed. Then they'll do that if they're that smart. So it's not really as foolproof as it sounds. This is an idea which is related to, now I'm forgetting his name, the wonderful economist, Tom Schelling. he has this lovely puzzle. What would you do if you were kidnapped and your kidnapper decides that he doesn't really want to collect their answer, he'd just as soon let you go, but he's afraid, of course, that you will rat on him and take him to the police, or let the police get him. What promise can you make to the kidnapper that would convince the kidnapper to let you go? Sets this problem. Do you know? Well, we're supposing that all you can do is talk. But Schelling has a very elegant solution to this problem. You confess to the kidnapper the worst thing you've ever done. Now you've put yourself in jeopardy. Now you have something to protect when you say, if I tell on you, you can tell on me. And if you haven't done anything terrible, do something terrible in his presence, whatever you think will be enough. The point is, Superman can't make a promise. Because who would trust Superman? Superman can break any promise with impunity. And AGIs are too much like Superman. We can't trust them.
I'm not sure the kidnappers could trust us. Wouldn't it be just as good to make up some story about something terrible that you've done, tell that to the kidnapper?
It might be, but you might have to go sometimes it's more cost effective to be honest.
That's true. The young gentleman on the end of the fourth row back.
Yeah, so at the end of your talk, you mentioned some kind of ways in which kind of policies we should implement for making AI good, but then suggested some ways in which perhaps market incentives would lead us to make AI which is not good in that way. And this seems to mirror the kind of incentives that we need to put in AI itself to make sure that it is good. So kind of there seems to be an analogy between the incentives that we need for people making AI in a market and the AI itself. And I'm wondering if solving kind of one problem there, the AGI problem, and solving the political philosophy question of how to organize a society are related and require similar types of answers.
Good. I think, if I'm following you right, I think, yes, they're related. After all, an AGI is a person except for the capacity that it's sort of immortal. But it has all the reasoning abilities and it has all the tactical. If you actually make one that's that clever, then it would have all the tactical and strategic abilities that any human being has, which means that it's going to be very capable at gaming any system that's created. So the best thing to do, though, is to try to create circumstances where the most cost-effective way of behaving is to be good. And our system is very imperfect, and it is in need of a great deal of reform, but still, it is good enough so that we can mostly lead fairly secure lives and plan ahead and count on the civilization not coming to a halt.
So do you think that the problems imposed by having AI mean that we need to have come up with better solutions in the political realm for our own lives?
I guess it's possible. In principle.
Yes.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. You mentioned quite a few times, I think, that you believe that conscious AI is possible in principle. Could you say more about what it is that is leading you to have that belief, that it is a a possibility?
I missed the key word in your sentence.
I'm just wondering what the reasons why you stated a number of times that conscious AGI is possible in principle. I'm just wondering what are the reasons that have brought you to that belief?
Oh, okay, sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's several hundred reasons right in this room. We're robots, made of robots, made of robots, made of robots, with no magical ingredients. If you're a materialist, if you believe that in the material basis of mind and consciousness, then it is almost a one-step argument that a conscious AGI is possible in principle, because we are conscious AGIs. The only difference is that we're made the old-fashioned way, and there's nothing that evolution and nurture and development can do that we can't do with technology if we want.
I want to take you up also on the leaving the heavy lifting to AI and having fun. Firstly, heavy lifting is fun, and your own life is such a wonderful example of that in every possible way. When you get the chance to, you get your hands dirty, you build your own walls, you do your own plumbing, you are done actually doing the slave jobs. And not only, I think, because you enjoy it, but also it's been a wonderful source of metaphors in your own writing. Pumps and trains and machinery and so on, which you've engaged with when you've done the heavy lifting, have continually informed the way you think about, have fun thinking about the larger issues. And I'm rather worried that if we leave too much of the heavy lifting to another class of beings, in fact, we're just going to lose a very powerful source of imagination.
Oh, well, I think that's right. But after all, most of the heavy lifting that's done by computing technology is the kind that we're just as well without, like being a telephone operator. That's a job that's not fit work for anybody. There are lots of tedious data analysis jobs that are too big and too tedious to do. You don't want to spend person centuries doing them if you can have a machine that does them. In my youth, I learned celestial navigation with compass and chronometer and sextant, and I dreamt of sailing myself across the Atlantic, navigating by celestial navigation. I've never had a chance to use those skills. I'm very glad I learned them. But it's now essentially impossible, except as a stunt, to do it. The insurance company won't let you take your boat out unless you have 3 GPS systems aboard for a trip like that. But I do think it's right that there are losses of imagination and losses of experience that we have to make sure we count when we're adding up the costs and benefits of all of these things.
Again, thanks for a lovely lecture. You talked a lot about consciousness and a lot about dangerousness, and I wonder how related you think they are. I doubt very much that I could convince anyone that I was a woman, but I have plans and preferences, and that's enough to make me dangerous. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts about whether it's necessary for an AI to be consciousness in order for it to be an existential threat.
On my view of consciousness, consciousness is an arena of control, an arena of self-control, which is only partially controlled, because there are too many degrees of freedom. There's not an infinite, but a vast number of degrees of freedom in a human-level agent. And there's no algorithm for controlling all those degrees of freedom. there's only, in effect, algorithms for exploiting the materials in that semi-chaotic set of possibilities to create degrees of self-control which are reliable enough to trust. But just think of your own stream of thought. To some degree you can control it, but ideas come to mind and they don't, and you try, you can't concentrate. All of these factors make consciousness very volatile, very versatile, very creative, and very dangerous. And I don't think there's an algorithmic way of blocking that. Oh, little bit of history of AI. One time, Marvin Minsky and I were sitting in his amazing house talking about AI, and Marvin came up with an idea for a short story that he wanted to write. Set sometime in the future, and it's the boardroom of United Amalgamated AI, and the engineers have just reported to the board that they've done it. They've got an AGI. Ta-da! That's great. And when do we put it to market? And the engineers say, well, there's one problem. We've actually achieved AGI. Yes, that's great. When do we market these things? No, you see, they don't want to do the things that we want them to do. They don't want to handle the airline reservation systems and all that. They complain bitterly about the heavy lifting that we're asking of them. And the board of directors says, well, just turn off the complainer. Just, can't you disable that part? And I said, no, that's the whole point. If they're really AGI, you can't turn off the complainer. They're going to break your heart with their stories of why they don't want to do what you want them to do. And the board is really puzzled what to do. And one of them gets an idea, and he says, how about this? Why don't we commission some public intellectual, some philosopher, eminent philosopher at a major West Coast university, to go around the world saying, if a robot ever says it's conscious, don't believe it. Don't believe it. It's just a Chinese room.
Yes, Dan, thanks for a lovely talk. But there's one thing, if you're concerned at the prospect of having persons who are immortal and untouchable, the simple fact is that we have many such persons already. We have states, we have religions, we have companies, we have charities. Cambridge University here was started in 1209 and it's still going strong. Many persons, legal persons, who are immortal and for practical purposes untouchable. Should we all be abolished?
No, of course they shouldn't. But that's because so far these superpersonal entities have been organized in ways that put responsible human agents in control. I said so far. And I agree that we may be moving out of an era where we can trust at least many of the laws and just the constraints of civilization and politeness and decorum, all of these things. I'm an incurable optimist. I can find a silver lining on any dark cloud. And one of my silver linings is that if we can just survive the next 2 years, we will have such a heightened appreciation of the fragility of our institutions and the need for honesty and decorum that this will have been a sort of wake-up call. And but it's going to be a close call.
The gentleman near the back there, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the very thought-provoking lecture. Are you concerned about whether it is possible to enforce that AI continue to be tools, especially if they are sophisticated as mind prosthetics that enhance imagination and whatnot? Surely it would be very easy for a rogue individual to modify them to be completely autonomous. For example, one of the MIT students that was protesting for the autonomy of cog.
Actually, I think I may be wrong, but I'm currently of the opinion that it's much, much harder than that. That, as I said, turning Watson, which is the product of, I don't know, person-centuries of brilliant engineering and uses the power of a small city, and it's not within orders of magnitude of being an autonomous AGI. It's a wonderful fabric, but it hasn't been made into an agent that has those powers at all yet. And I don't think it is going to be easy to, what it is going to be easy to do, if we don't very much on guard against it, is to fool people into thinking that we've made an AGI when we haven't. That does worry me.
Can you explain more thoroughly why the deception that's motivated by the Turing test is a problem? It seems like on a basic level, a certain type of, the designers of the programs are motivated to deceive the judge. But once the program is sufficiently complex, if the program is motivated to deceive the judge, then that could be a further evidence that it in fact has general intelligence.
That could be a further
Evidence that the program itself is generally intelligent, that it itself is motivated to deceive.
I'm not sure I'm hearing you exactly right. You're saying that if the program...
So in terms of deception, in the way that the programs are designed, yes, it would be a problem if the designer is motivated to deceive a judge, essentially.
Which is certainly true today.
Which is certainly true.
Yeah.
If a program is sufficiently complex, though, and the program has some sort of ability to learn that its goal is to deceive, then why is it a problem that it's motivated toward deception? Because if it's able to deceive and has awareness of something like that, it could be a signal that it is in fact intelligent.
Well, you see, this is really precisely why I want to maintain the tool-colleague barrier and not give AGI systems the sort of strategic imagination that would allow them. Look, this is just a generalization of a point that's been made by a lot of people recently, and that is, if you think there's a kill switch on an AGI, you're fooling yourself. The first thing a really intelligent AGI is going to do is figure out how to disable the kill switch. And it doesn't have to have fingers. It doesn't have to be a robot, though it can reach back and disable the kill switch. Maybe it'll just persuade with words somebody to disable the kill switch. Maybe it will simply charm the users into obedience. There's all sorts of possibilities of that sort that I would rather we keep them slaves and tools and not open that avenue at all.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for a great lecture. I just wanted to clarify, get clear one thing. I'm over here. It's several times you slid gracefully from talking about AI, general AI, strong AI, into consciousness, as if there's an inevitability that once a system crosses some threshold of intelligence, that it necessarily starts to have subjective conscious feelings of the sort that you and I do. And I can't help wonder whether this is an assumption, whether this is an assumption you're making, and if so, on what it rests, because it seems to me that one can separate these two concepts. There are certainly creatures, or certainly for most of us, other living species that almost certainly have conscious experiences of suffering and pain, which we would not attribute high intelligence to. So why should consciousness become part of a system once it crosses a threshold of intelligence? Because that makes a big difference to all the ethical questions that you then raise about how we treat these other systems or species and what that does to us too.
Thank you, Alan. That's a good question, very much on my mind. Yes, of course, animals suffer, some much more than others, much more capable of suffering. But if you stop and think, what does suffering amount to? It's got to be, well, the answer can't be intrinsic awfulness of pain or the intrinsic awfulness of suffering. That's just passing the buck. That's not an answer. Intrinsic just can't carry the weight. So if something is capable of suffering, it's got to have the sorts of hopes and projects and plans and activities that are thwarted, interfered with, and that it minds for that reason. Pain wouldn't bother you if it didn't interrupt your life course in some way, prevent you from doing things you want to do. And I think that if you're an AGI that has projects and plans and goals and so forth, then the capacity for suffering is essentially built in by that very fact. And we shouldn't think that we don't have to worry about suffering there because, they don't have C fibers or nociceptors. That's irrelevant. But that's not a very good answer. That's just that my good answer is about an hour long. If it's good, maybe it's not.
So you seem to be saying that tools and colleagues are distinct categories of agents that should be kept separate. And yet, if I understand the example correctly, in elderly care, you might want to have an instance of an agent that can perform more than one task. Now, in deep learning, so one of the reasons why it was so surprising that it produces such impressive results was that the technology hadn't fundamentally changed. The computational power has increased, and by just adding layers, we can achieve results that we wouldn't have thought possible. So I'm wondering now that how do we know that if we combine just state-of-the-art algorithms for solving particular problems with some sort of meta-level categorization machine that would just pick the right tool for the problem at hand, how do we know that building something like this would not ultimately produce consciousness as a side effect?
Oh, I think it could. In principle, I just think it's very hard. And I think it's not just a question of adding, you say adding meta levels. I think that's part of the answer. I mean, meta in a strong sense. Once you have systems that not only can notice things that no human being can notice, we've got those. We've got tons of those now with deep learning. But that can notice that they're noticing things. And notice that they're noticing things. And think about what that means. once you add those layers, you can't add them unless you give them work to do. And when you give them work to do, you're turning them into a conscious agent. Because there's, in case anybody wonders what my view is on it, because there's no difference between a conscious agent and a very intelligent zombie.
Good evening. I think it's commendable to seek to impose restrictions on AI in order to make it more compatible with the lives we want to lead. But surely it only takes one unscrupulous lab or one unscrupulous state, e.g. China, to pursue AI without ethical restrictions, and then we're all bound to have to abandon those restrictions in order to keep up with that state. So is it really a sort of evolutionarily stable strategy to have restrictions on AI at all?
Well, we've tried similar things with other technologies that are scary. And the big difference, as I'm sure you would hasten to remind me, is that we really don't have to worry about somebody building a nuclear bomb in their garage. The heavy industry, the technology to build a nuclear device and fuel it is fortunately beyond the reach of hobbyists. And it's not entirely clear that bad AI is similarly out of reach. I think there's a more pressing problem, and that is, if you want to know my pet example of what I have fear in the immediate future from technology, is I fear the day when the internet goes down and takes with it the power grid and takes with it the television channels and the phone system. And if the internet went down, that would probably happen. And what I'm afraid of is the panic that would spread wherever this happened within an hour or two. If you plunged, say, the United States into electronic darkness, you go out to your car, you turn on the radio, there's not even anything on the radio in your car. You're suddenly cut off from all the electronics. I think people would go into panic mode, and they'd do more. Let's suppose we could fix the internet within 48 hours. But in that 48 hours, what I'm worried about is the destruction caused by panic, which I think would dwarf every disaster that's ever hit civilization. And I think the only cure, the only protection we have against that is to start talking about it and creating grassroots local communities who don't depend on electronic communication at all if they don't have it, to be panic absorbers in those first 48 hours. So that when the world goes dark, instead of immediately thinking, I got to rob a gas station and get the last petrol on the block so I can run up into the hills with my guns and my family to protect them, I think, well, wait a minute, my nearest panic absorber is just down in the church basement down the road. Let's go there and see what we can do to keep everybody calm until they fix this. I think that is a project for the immediate future that I put way ahead of devising the rules for protecting us from AGI, which is decades away.
I think we're a little bit over time. I think, since I've given you the microphone, so, but could we please keep it short?
It'll be very quick. Thank you, Dan. Although I must say I found that rather negative and dystopian. In the same way as humans can be kind, do you not believe that AGIs can be kind? and therefore control other AGIs to be kind and create their own society that is a kinder society and a benevolent one, and one that helps repair rather than destroy?
I don't see any strong reason to assume or suppose that AGIs will be kind. No, I'm not assuming they're going to be evil either. I'm just assuming that they're going to be as volatile and as out of our control as we are. I don't control you, you don't control me. I'm happy to live in the world with you because you've been educated and you were raised to be a honest, law-abiding citizen, and so are we all. But it's very hard to see how any process of education and nurture of a super AGI would make an agent that was a reliably moral agent.
Thank you. Apologies to, there were a lot of hands and people I didn't have time to get to, but I'm afraid we're over time. Before we finish, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Dan for a fascinating talk. One reflection from me before we finish. It occurred to me as I was thinking what to say at the beginning, when I was telling the story of how I got you lost in Sydney the first time we met. But that's not an experience a young philosopher or anybody else could really have these days, precisely because my phone would be telling us where we're going. Speaking from personal experience, I say we've lost something there, because the opportunity to get lost with somebody like you at the age I was then, it was a very valuable thing. And thank you for coming us.
I had two of the most memorable hours of my life being lost in the desert, trying to find our way to a party, a Santa Fe Institute party with John Maynard Smith. And I learned more in those 2 hours than I think at any other time, maybe in my life. So, yes, getting lost could be wonderful.
Yeah, with the right person. Thank you very much.